Thank you, Madam Chair. I will present to you the main findings and recommendations of our audit of how the Commission is handling macroeconomic imbalance procedure. Our assessment is basically that the Commission needs to substantially improve certain aspects of how it is managing MIP. And I will now focus primarily on the recommendations, but then will provide some background why we came with such proposals for consideration of the Commission. First, we think that the link between the analysis of macroeconomic imbalances and the recommendations, finally country-specific recommendations, needs to be strengthened. The ideal way how to do that would roughly look like follows. I mean, in so-called IDRs, or in-depth reviews, one would start with the analysis of the imbalances, then it would provide assessment of their severity. After that, one would move to discuss policy options and possibly quantify them to see how much each proposed measure could actually alleviate the established macroeconomic imbalances. And on the basis of such analysis, one would finally formulate country-specific recommendations. And actually what we are proposing is not something completely new, because at the beginning of the macroeconomic procedure, exactly this is what IDRs were about. You were able to find in IDRs analysis, you were able to find the assessment of the severity, you were able to find policy discussions, and some broadly defined recommendations, although final recommendations would be established by the Commission in a subsequent documents. If I were looking for one deficiency in these original IDRs, that would be the absence of fiscal policy considerations, because the regulation clearly said that the impact of fiscal policy and income policy on imbalances should be taken account, and that the fiscal policy should be seen as an instrument to address the existing imbalances. Now, this was missing also in the original IDRs. Now, since I opened this issue of fiscal policy, this more or less in later phases, this has remained absent, with one exception. The exception was recent analysis of the fiscal surpluses in Germany and their effects on cross-border imbalances in other member states. I think that this was a good step forward, but we think that the issue of fiscal policy should not be left only to the Stability and Growth Pact. Stability and Growth Pact deals only with medium-term fiscal sustainability. It doesn't deal with with the effect of fiscal policy on imbalances. It doesn't deal with the effects of fiscal policy on current account and competitiveness. So we think that analysis of fiscal policy and use of fiscal policy should be an integral part of the MIP, just as it is actually envisaged in the regulation itself. Now, I described how the original in-depth reviews looked like, but let me now present how the things have later developed. First, the assessment of the degree of imbalances was taken out of IDRs, and it was moved into so-called Commission communication. Then the policy options were also moved out of the IDRs, and I will come back to it. So in some aspect, and then at the end, instead of issuing separate document, which was clearly envisaged by the regulation, the Commission started inserting something called summary of imbalances into its country reports on structural reforms. And this has certainly affected the visibility and possibility that visibility of the whole MIP procedure, and the possibility to convince the general public that there is a need to address those imbalances and to explain what kind of actions are needed for that purpose. And when the Commission took out these policy discussions out of IDRs, it started using roughly the following procedure. All reform proposals that were coming from Europe 2020 agenda would be screened, and then they would be labeled as macroeconomic MIP relevant. And the list is usually quite long. And this is how you lose focus. And then also the Commission doesn't make distinction between very long-term reforms that do in a long run increase the potential growth rate, but in the, let's say, medium term, cannot have any substantive effect on economic imbalance. If, for example, a country is having a large structural current account imbalance, but at the same time it is, let's say, implementing some long-term education reform. This long-term education reform, yes, indeed, in some very long run would affect the potential growth rate of the economy, although how much it's actually very difficult to establish. But it is highly unlikely that this kind of structural reforms can in any meaningful way affect established, let's say, current account deficit or, let's say, large negative net investment position of a country in a reasonable number of years so as to prevent possible crises down the road. So in this way, the recommendations itself became very much detached from the analysis, and this doesn't help. The Commission, in reply, said that country-specific recommendations should not reflect only the last in-depth review, that they might reflect some previous ones, that they might reflect some other Commission documents. Yes, possibly so, but it's very difficult for the public to understand why is then specific recommendation formulated if one would have to look across a large number of documents to find economic rationale for that. And this detachment of the recommendations from the analysis actually it does affect weak rate of implementation of this imbalance. Now we didn't have to analyze ourselves on this implementation. The Commission itself produced convincing documents which show that the implementation rate, substantive interpretation, is actually very low. Our next recommendation is that the Commission should indeed activate excessive imbalance procedure whenever there is evidence that the Member State is facing those imbalances. However, so far the Commission has never recommended to the Council such a step. It has introduced the notion of excessive imbalances which do require such a procedure and excessive imbalances which do not require such a procedure. And then, in fact, it has never activated the procedure itself. This has raised concern by the 5 presidents in their report, where they clearly said that the corrective arm, which means excessive imbalance procedure, should be used forcefully and triggered as soon as excessive imbalances are identified. And then the European Central Bank also recently noted that the use of all tools of MIP, including the corrective arm, is in the interest of the euro area as a whole. Our next recommendation is that the Commission should adopt, publish, and apply clear criteria and processes for the classification of imbalances. So we think that more clarity is needed why each country is put into one of those categories, particularly making distinction between countries which are put into excessive imbalance category, but no procedure is implemented, and those who might one day potentially, or on a basis on which one day this procedure might eventually be started. I have mentioned the fiscal, and basically we are saying we acknowledge positive steps done by the Commission in the case of crossover effects of large fiscal surpluses at a time when monetary policy is facing constraints of the low interest rate. We think that the analysis done for Germany was an appropriate one. It came perhaps somewhat late, but it was certainly a step in a good direction. But we think that this fiscal policy should also be analyzed in the countries that are having problems with, let's say, large negative investment position, because the link is quite strong between that. And then we are urging Commission to improve communication. We made a proposal that commissioners should be available to national parliaments to explain why country is specified in particular category and why specific recommendations have been made. This might be one good step into it. Then also, as I said, clearer link between analysis and recommendations should help the Commission to seek support from the general public in member state countries. Currently, the approach is not suitable for that. So let's put it this way. Now, let me say that we had something like 15 recommendations in 6 groups. And let me now say something about the 2 that the Commission did not accept. One is related to the publishing clear criteria for the classification. And the other one is, we propose that in the next context of the next review, the Commission proposes amendments to the existing text of regulation that would codify the current practice of having two categories of excessive imbalance procedures. Because currently the text in the regulation reads as follows. It says that, let me just quickly find it, it says that if severe macroeconomic imbalances are identified, an excessive imbalance procedure should be initiated. This is the regulation. The Commission says the following, that this doesn't impose an obligation on the Commission to present a recommendation, but expresses the political desideratum of the co-legislator to make things in a particular way. Since you are one of the co-legislators, I guess that such interpretation might be of your interest. In any case, whether you accept the interpretation of the Commission or you don't, there is a good case that there is that amendments be made so that there is full consistency between actual practice and what is written in the recommendation, in the regulation. Thank you, Madam Chair.